Hi everyone, this is Alan Mackay. I'm going to just briefly talk about how to create smoke plumes, like smokestacks from oil fires, building destruction, or just generic large-scale smoke pillars. So we're going to build just like a basic setup that you can kind of change to be whatever you want. So initially, a couple of things I want to do. I just want to make sure I'm in the right film space, so I want to go to film for the correct frame rate, and I'll set this to be about 250 frames, as we're going to have like a pretty slow moving stack. Now the other thing I need to do is I want to build this to scale. So I'm going to go to unit setup. I'm going to change this to meters for the time being, or whatever you want, whether it be feet or whichever system you want to work with. Now I'm just going to build a box to represent kind of the size of my smoke pillar, so you can get a good idea. So let's say I want to make this, let's just say 10 meters tall, which is fairly tall, and maybe 4 by 4. So fairly big. And then from here we can begin to change it to make it blow in the wind or whatever we want to do. Now that we have that set up, like if we want, we can select it, right click, go to properties, make it non-renderable and display as box. And that way if I want to render it, nothing actually renders and it's just always displaying as a box. Now, usually you'd go about creating this maybe emitting from an object or something like that, but I do want to try and keep in mind that I want to be able to position this and add this into shots fairly easily. So I'm just going to go straight into particle flow. I'm going to get rid of my depot and description just so that way uh, I have a lot more space to work with. So under display I'm going to turn off depot and description, and that way I just have a better p-flow window to work with here. Alright, so first of all, I'm just going to right click and make an empty flow, select it. Now in here we can see that's been added into our shot. Alright, so in here we can change by selecting this node the dimensions to be a little bit bigger or smaller, whatever I want to do. So let's just set this to be about 1 meter by 1 meter, and under viewport we'll set the percentage to 100%. That way we see all the particles in the viewport. Other than that, everything else looks fine. Yeah, this is all good. I'm going to right click and choose rename, and I'll just rename this to smokestack. Alright, so that way we just have a system named correctly. I'm going to right click and go to birth and just add in a birth event. Link this up, and we can set this to emit for 250 frames if we like, and we'll set the rate to be whatever we feel. I'll set it to 200 for the time being, but we'll get back to this. Now, a couple of things. First of all, if I wanted, I could go into space warps. Let's just add in a wind and a drag. We can add other stuff later if we need to. Now, if I wanted, I could just assign wind and have it blowing up, but maybe we'll give it some initial velocity. Okay, so right now, by default, our system is aiming downwards, so either we rotate this to aim upwards, or when we set the speed, we set it in reverse. What I'll do is I'll just right click and choose rotate, and I'm just going to rotate this 180 degrees, just so that way this little arrow is aiming upwards. Because when I right click here and go to operator speed to add in some speed, what's going to happen is the system is essentially going to want to shoot the particles in the direction of this arrow. The other thing I need to do first is actually append and add in a position icon. Let's put that above. Now the reason is that way it knows where it's actually placed these particles. Without this, it doesn't know where the position is, so it actually emits to you know, a random, or I should say usually the world transform space of 000, but either way it definitely does need to have a position assigned. Alright, so now we can see our particles are emitting, obviously too fast, but that's a good point for us to be at. Now under here, we'll set the speed to maybe 1, so that way they're emitting out with a bit of speed, and I'm going to right click and add in a force operator, and we'll add in our drag. Now by adding in drag, we see that the particles slow down instantly. So what's happening is the velocity is decaying over time based on this. So in other words, the equation for that is essentially velocity divided by time um, to slow it down. Now, what we can do is, first of all, let's select our drag, because essentially what's going to happen is after frame 100, they're going to speed back up. And that's because our drag by default goes from 0 to 100. It's kind of annoying, so we'll set that to 0 to 1000. So most likely we're going to have enough frames. And that way we see that the decay applies, or the drag, the entire time. Now the thing is, we don't want them to stop right away, but we do want them to slow down over time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add in some wind into this as well. Wind is a constant velocity, whereas the speed is just an initial velocity, so that way it loses it over time, whereas this will continue to reinforce it. So if I click on add under my force, I can then add in my wind, and it will show up here. And now our particles are moving much quicker. So having selected wind in the modify panel, I'm just going to slow this down a lot, so that way the particles will continue to move. So they have some initial speed, and then they begin to slow down and move up. Now, essentially, we could replicate this exact result just by having speed applied and no drag. What I actually want to do is have a range indicator turned on and set some decay. The idea is that I want these particles to slow down based on this decay. So by having range indicator turned on, we can see that we have this planar area specifying where the fall off is. So what actually happens is that wind is affecting everything within this range, and then it begins to decay off. So that just means that particles will slow down over time. And I can also, if I want, rotate this later to do whatever I want to it. Okay, so that's pretty handy to have. Alright, so now we have some particles meeting up. What we'll do next is I'm going to just maybe select my position icon, and we'll change this to maybe a pivot. And by doing that, it's going to emit from the center. There's a few ways we can do this, but let's try setting it to the pivot, and then selecting our speed, and we'll set divergence. And this way we can get particles to emit out from that point, and then begin to rise up in the air. Now, with my wind still selected, I might play with my decay, just manually putting in these numbers till I can find something that I like. Maybe 0.005, and that way it's got some decay enough that it will start to slow down when it gets to that point. Now, while we're in here, we can set some turbulence, and turbulence essentially is going to help make this a more interesting pattern. Now, the idea is that I want this to happen over time. I don't want it to initially just have this really magical turbulent feel to it. I want exactly like how it looks right now. I actually want this to happen over time. So if I look at this, it is fairly slow, but essentially it's still too much. What I'll do is I'll set the frequency lower, and I'll set my turbulence value much lower. And so the idea is that over time, this is going to begin to break apart. I might raise my frequency a little bit, maybe to 2, and I'll set my scale a little bit higher. I just want to get something that breaks apart over time. And when I've got that, I might also hold down shift and move my wind aside. Make sure it's selected as copy and not instance or reference, so that way this is an individual space warp. And with this one, I'm going to set the strength of the wind to 0, so that way it's not affecting it. And then I'm going to just add another turbulence essentially. But selecting my force operator, I'm going to add in this new wind, and we'll set the scale much lower. And that way we're just getting a bigger overall effect on this wind. And I might set the frequency to 1 or lower, just something that isn't too phasing. If I lower the frequency, I might want to up the scale to compensate for that. But the idea is I just want to break this pattern up a little bit. And I'll lower the turbulence strength. Alright, so we can play with that more later, but ideally I just want to get some interesting kind of pattern. Alright, so at this stage we're just getting the basic formation of our system, but now I want to go in and add a shader to this. Okay, so first of all I want to add in a light. So in the front viewport I'm going to go to Create Panel, the lights, make sure I'm in Standard. I'm just going to create a target spotlight, position it. What I can do is either hit Shift 4 or go right click on your front view spotter 1 and I can hit Control R or click here. I can reposition this wherever I want, so I just want to get a bit more of a side view. Essentially in the top viewport I can do the same thing, but ideally I just want to have my light positioned somewhere nice. And in the modify panel we'll just enable shadow map. I might change this to actually a ray trace shadow, and I'll select shadow parameters, turn on atmosphere shadows. The reason is that way if we turn on atmosphere shadows, it then communicates with afterburn, which is how we're going to create our smokestack here. Now going to rendering, environment, I'm going to go add afterburn, and that'll add it into the shot. Alright, so selecting afterburn. In here I can select my particle system if I like, but what I might do just for the hell of it, going back into particle flow, I might right click, append miscellaneous pflow aburn. And what this is essentially it's a portal to link particle flow with afterburn. And what it does is instead of selecting my entire system, like if I click on my system and go select by name, rather than just showing my pflow or PFS smokestack, it now has this pflow aburn in the scene as well. And so rather than selecting the entire system, what this does is it allows me to specify this node, which is what I'll do. Okay, so now it's added in here. What happens is essentially this will say rather than the entire system, it'll only use this one event as my particle system. Okay, so in other words, if I had a much more complicated system like rocks that landed on the ground creating dust, I might want the rocks to actually be an afterburn system, only the dust that gets emitted. So I would put one of these operators into this event. Now I'm going to right click and rename this to PFAB for pflow after aburn, and I'll call this smokestack, and we'll see it updates here as well. So this is just a little bit more identifiable than pflow aburn. Instead it's PFAB, which we know is the node, and then smokestack. Alright, while I'm doing that, select source lights, and I'll add in my spot, and that way my light is added in too. And from here at least, I can click on display, and the particles will show up in the viewport. So we can see the default radius of our smokestack now. Okay, so that's good. Alright, so a couple of things. Essentially we can set the radius, we can do a lot of stuff, but ideally every particle system needs a life and death so it can calculate how to scale things over age and do all that kind of stuff. So going back in our particle system, I'm going to append miscellaneous, whoops, no, I'm going to go to operator, sorry, and go to the delete operator. Here I'm going to specify the lifespan to be maybe 400 frames, so it's fairly long. And that way by doing that it means that it has a birth and a death, so in other words, when you're calculating things like getting particles to fade over their particle age, it will know that its lifespan is 400 frames, so it can say, opacity is 1.0 at frame 30 when it gets emitted, and then it'll be opacity of 0 at frame 430. Okay, and at frame 215 it will be opacity 0.5. It'll be able to calculate its entire lifespan based on that. So it's quite essential. And adding variation in here can be good. We can add it into Afterburn as well, but that's good. The reason we need this is because we'll scroll down to sphere radius. I can right click and choose enable, and I can set the end radius to 100. So what actually happens is the particles start out at a radius of 10, and then over 400 frames, which is the particle lifespan, set PA for particle age right here, the particles will scale up to 100, so 10 times their radius. So we can work out kind of roughly what we want. If I want, I can right-click here and change my time configuration to see the entire lifespan if I wanted to, just so that way I can see the end result. So I might say, okay, well that's a little bit too big, but let's scale it to about there, which is 40 frames. Sorry, 40 value. And so now we have the particles will scale up over time. The thing is that the way that things like this usually work, just like how we have the speed operator and the wind, is that they essentially have their initial energy or their initial formation. And what happens is they'll begin to expand based on their heat um, and their actual body. And so they'll tend to scale up much quicker. And they'll also kind of stir and move around and force themselves out of that initial smokestack. But so they kind of essentially scale up very quickly. So clicking here, we can add that in. We can essentially, this is a timeline, it's very linear, but I can click here and we can tell it to scale much quicker. So essentially what's going to happen is particles move much quicker because they have energy within them, essentially from the heat. But then later, the particles will begin to scatter and dissolve because the wind is then pulling them apart as they begin to drift up into the air. So they can going to still continue to expand and break apart, but at a much slower rate. So this is something we can do, just essentially get some kind of scaling in there and everything else we want. And we can play with this, okay, we can move it to whatever formation we'd like. And while we're in there, we can also bring up particle flow and go to divergence, and we can play with how much that's actually spreading apart. So we can play with this to kind of work out the formation that we want for our smokestack. So I might lower down to like 30, so that way I get more of a directional smokestack. I could also get my drag and lower its drag value to like 3, and that way it's going to have more force to it. So there's a lot of things I can play with here, and it's entirely up to you to do what you want and what you think looks best. So going back to my sphere radius, I'm just going to pull this up a little bit. Again, the values are all based on what you think visually looks good. You don't need to necessarily copy my exact values. You can use, you know, your eye to get a good idea as to how this should look. But I think that will look quite good. Because I'm emitting to frame 400, I might go back in here and tell this to emit to 400. Because I'm using a rate, it's going to emit the same amount the whole time. If I were to use a total and I set this to be 2000, then it's going to emit 2000 particles over that lifespan. But then if I set this to be over 4000, what's going to happen is it's going to emit less because the total is now stretched over a much larger time frame of like 8 times or something. So it's quite important, or sorry, 10 times. So it's quite important to use rate in situations like this. That way you have a constant value that you can change all the time, because you don't want to get to the point where your system is almost complete and then the director says, that's perfect, now just extend it 60 more frames. And when you do that, suddenly the particle count changes and everything else changes. It's better to think long term and get a better idea as to what your end result is going to be and how to make it more flexible. Alright, so let's just do a couple more things and then we can start to look at how this is actually going to look rendered. So first of all, we've set up our sphere radius, and the way this works is that we have sphere radius and then we have noise. Okay, so we have the actual noise inside the shape. The way this works is the same way that if we load up a material editor, this would be our sphere radius, this ball here. So I then go in and add in a noise to it, and this would be the internal noise pattern inside of it. So essentially this would be mapped onto it. I mean, that's essentially how like this Raymaster shader works. So although the sphere radius might be rather big, we could set the noise size to be quite small. Then we get all this internal scattering that's very small. Or we can set it quite big, and then naturally it's going to be a much bigger shape. we can set the levels much higher, we can set high and low values. We can do all this stuff with our volumetric shader. But essentially the noise, as we can see as I scale this down, is getting more scattered, or we can get a more friendlier, puffier effect. So that's exactly what we're going to do here. We've got this set to 10 and to 40, so I might do that. I might right click and enable the noise size and set this to 40 as well. The other thing is that the scaling on this looks like that. This is still set to the original linear age. So what I can do is I can scroll up to sphere radius, right click, copy, scroll down, right click, paste. Now when I click on this, it's the exact same animation curve. So that's good. It just means it'll sync up a lot better. We can change it from there if we wanted. Usually we don't have to. Lastly, let's go down to FBM Fractal. If I click on this preview, we can see this is like what our puff looks like. Not really what we want. Let's click and change this to turbulence. And we'll set the levels to about 6. Exactly the same as the levels in here. Okay, so all the same terminology. We have phase, you name it. I can even get the blur, scroll down a little bit, and the detail, add that up a little bit. Between the two, we're getting all the subtle detail where it's artifacting and everything else. This is actually a good thing, and it kind of helps what we're doing. Other than that, everything looks good. Let's scroll up the top here. Now, before I go any further, I might just go into my speed and set some variation in pflow, just to kind of break this up a little bit. And then, lastly, I think we're about good. Let's render out a frame. You might want to save your work at this point, but let's render out a frame and see how this looks. Alright, so first of all, when we first render it out, it's going to look really white. And there's two reasons for this. Afterburn 4, when it got recompiled, it became, the color now gets kind of introduced as not only color, but an additive kind of self-multiplier in itself. Essentially, when we have bright whites, they then become additive on themselves. So instead of going for a lighter gray, we might go for a more darker gray, and that way it's not, it's not multiplying on itself. So then we're going to get much more of a respectable color for what we're doing. Now the other thing is that it looks very flat. So then we scroll up, we turn on self shadows, and as long as we have set up the light and under shadow parameters set it up for atmosphere shadows, now this should shadow correctly. And as we can see, this looks really good. That's exactly what we want. We're getting this really nice kind of smokestack effect. Rendering is kind of slow, so we can start to optimize that. I'm going to click cancel on this, and under step size I'm going to set this to 5 and shadows to 5. That's a good feature of Afterburn 4 is the fact that now these are separate, because you might want your step size and your shadows to be as detailed as your ray marcher itself. But by adjusting the step size, it's essentially going to sample less times inside the shader. So we render this again, it should render much quicker, but unfortunately it's going to look a lot more harder shelled because it's stepping through a lot less. So the secret is to kind of find those key values. You might notice in my settings I set the ray marcher to 2 and the shadows to 3, because the shadows I mightn't care as much about than my actual ray marcher. So it's just a matter of kind of playing around with this to kind of find the result you're after. But this is looking kind of nice. I'll click cancel. And obviously the lighting is coming from the front, so we have that kind of shadow in the back. So we'll look at lighting that soon. But let's render out a frame front on. And we can see that this looks really nice. It's very dense, which we might want to change. Lowering the density is going to slow down our render considerably, because it's going to then not only step through more times, but it's also then going to be transparent, so it'll require more stepping. So again, Afterburn 4 is very sensitive with a lot of things, so the settings are quite different to how they used to be. Density needs to be quite low. I would usually never have my density down to 0.3. I would have it maybe at like 1. So here I have a 0.3, and this looks about what I want. Because I've lowered the density, I can actually raise my step size higher, because now it's not as hard edged. So we can kind of balance between those two. So I think I just set that to 5 before we get that really hard edge, but now by lowering the density, it's kind of compensating for that. So at this point, because the renders are slower, we're not going to do as many, but we can kind of get the idea as to how this is going to look. I also might render out maybe at a lower resolution, like 100, which is very low res, but this should work pretty well. Now, I'm pretty happy with this. We've got the movement going, and it's emitting out, slowing down. We got the turbulence, everything else is happening. I kind of like this. I think it's working quite well. So what I might do is I might go into my original window 1 and I might rotate this a little bit so we can get this kind of blowing off to the side. And I can kind of play with this a little bit, but the idea is that maybe over time it begins to shift over to the edge more. It's not as straightforward. And that way we'll just get it kind of blowing off to the side more. Now this is very small, but hopefully it'll give us a good indication as to how this will look. Well, not really, but it does help. So this is looking good. We're getting it to blow off to the edge, and it's quite nice. Again, I could raise my density a little bit so that way it would render much quicker, which I might need to do just while I'm working on formations. And we can kind of, play with this as much as we want to get the result that we're after. And again, a couple of the key things here is like divergence. I could bring this in a lot and then move it over, so that can help too with playing with the divergence to kind of choose how broken up it's going to be and everything. If I never like my actual formation, in here I can go to position. I can change that if I like. Actually, position won't affect it all because the pivot. If this set the surface, it would affect it a little bit. But the main thing that I would play with is my uniqueness seed. By adjusting this, the formation can change drastically. Alright, so, and then again with my turbulence as well. So I'm just playing with this maybe to see if I get some more interesting kind of results. And so I'm pretty happy with where this is going. What I might do at this point though is I might get my light and position it let's say more let's say more behind. So that way we're giving you more of a rim light effect. And then what I might do is add in another light. And this one I'll position more more as just like a fill or ambient. Should be more like an ambient. I won't worry about casting shadows at this point, but I might adjust that later. I'll set the multiplier to 0.2. And we'll scroll up the top here and we add in our light. And at this point I might also add in a camera just so that we have a fixed position. So the top viewport, I'm just adding in a camera and finding where that camera's position will be. Now with my wind, I might adjust the strength. Again, I'm just adjusting it to kind of play with the formation a little bit, just to break it up. Now I will need to play with this, but now we can see they have that nice kind of rim light, which is kind of a neat kind of look for it. And we can bring it around a little bit just to kind of get more of a nicer effect. I could also with this one turn on shadows just to kind of see how that's going to affect it. So here we're just getting this nicer kind of rim lighting on the edge, which works quite well. and we can render it with and without shadows to kind of decide how we like it. The shadows here can be multiplied as well, so I can adjust the color density, and I think that should affect it. Yeah, it does. So if we like, we don't need the shadows to be as harsh on this light here. But when I'm happy with it, what I would look at doing is lowering the density quite a lot. So maybe 0.2. Again, that will slow down my render considerably, so I might want to play with the step size a little bit if I like. But essentially this is going to give me a nicer looking smoke, because the other one is just way too dense. So just for the sake of rendering this for the tutorial, I might adjust my multiplier up considerably. So that renders much better. So lastly, ambient color is something I can play with too if I want. I can make this more of like a dirty kind of color, or I can make it really bright, whatever I feel like doing. And that's essentially the ambient kind of fill inside of it. So you notice it will brighten it up a lot. So that is worth playing around with to kind of find like a value that might work for you. And lastly, my color, I might actually make this more of a darker color. And we'll scroll down the bottom. I might set my density to actually fade over age to 0, and I'll make that linear, okay? So that way, essentially it's going to be lighter at the top. Now, because I made the color so dark, it's going to be very hard to see. So you might want to change your background to be more of like a brighter color. But essentially, I want to make this more of a dark kind of smoke stack to put into some shots. I might play with the lighting just a little bit more. And on this one, I might adjust the density of the shadow a little bit. Alright, so that's looking good. You might want to play the turbulence, stuff like that, to break it up a bit, but I like where that's going. I might, just for the sake of color, I might bump the color information up a little bit. The reason is that in my comp, like in my actual shots, I'll want this to be much darker, but I'd rather render it with a bit more variation in color, so that way in the comp I can bring it up and down. So for instance, I could get the rim lighting and I punch that up a bit, but bring the rest down. So I just get a bit more variation in here. But that looks really good. I like where that's going. And I might just punch this up a little bit more. And if I do this, I might want to adjust my color down. We'll see how that goes. Alright, so at this stage I think we're pretty much done with the main element. Again, you can make this spread out more, you can do whatever you want. I've pointed all that out. And we have the smoke coming out, it's doing its thing, and eventually it dies out. So that's really good, I'm happy with that. What I'll do at this point is I actually want to have two versions of this. I actually want to have my thick smoke, so I'll rename this to AB thick smoke, and I'll also click on save, and I'll choose a directory where to save this called AB thick smoke. Essentially, it's just my afterburn preset. I'm gonna click on add and choose afterburn, and I'm gonna go and add in my PFAB smokestack again and both of my lights, and then I'm gonna click on the load button right here, and I'll add in my AB smokestack. Now what I'll do is I'm going to rename this to AB thin smoke. Okay, I'm going to go back to thick and I'm going to turn that off just by click on active. Go back to this one and let's make that circle. Okay, so what we can do is enable display. I might make this circle just for the sake of making it display a bit quicker. But essentially now we have our smokestack is duplicated. What we'll do is I'll turn off self shadows, so that way this one that renders doesn't have any self shadowing. So in other words, it's going to look flat. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to make my value at the radius about 50 and 20, maybe 15 at the beginning. Just that way it actually is going to get a bit bigger than my actual smoke. Scroll down, do the same, 50 and 15, and now this will just be slightly bigger if we see how it's rendering. But I'm going to set my density down to like 0.05. This way I'm rendering a much thinner smoke, okay? And I'll play with rendering it even lighter. The idea is that I just want to render a much thinner, kind of smoky, wispy stuff, and I'll try to bring the radius up even more to essentially give me a nicer result of like that I can play with. I can blend between the really thick stuff and the really thin stuff. I might just make my color a little bit brighter for this one, just that way I can see a lot more detail inside of it. The other thing I can do if I like, I can scroll at the top and under every nth I could put 10, and that way what's going to happen is it's going to render a 10th particle, and that way we can see that we can put a lot more definition into our particles and also have them and not having to rely on them layering up. So keeping that the same, we've made it 75. I might make this about 75 for the noise size, just to kind of match that. But I'll lower my density a little bit. So the idea is I just want to have like a softer version of the smoke that I can also render out, and that way in the composite I can layer the two together and even mask where I want some bits to have softer areas. But the whole idea is that way I have like two levels of stuff to play with. And for my noise, the step size, I could lower that to 5, just to kind of get that back in there. We could turn on self-shadowing if we wanted. It may get a little slow, as we can see. So it's entirely up to you whether you want to do that. Otherwise, I could turn self-shadow off, and there's also the Lambert. Whoops. So I could set the Lambert, and that's just going to give it more of a gradual fall off to it. So you can play with that, and the noise is another option as two distinct ways to deal with that. But so you use Lambert, but I'll keep that off. But now we have the soft smoke, and we also turn that off, and I'll turn this on. You could even try rendering them together if you liked. And let's lower the step size a little bit. And then we have the thick smoke rendering out as well. Again, you might want to play with your step size and your density. Between the two, you should be able to get some really cool results. And again, it really depends on thickness, but if you wanted, you could go for a much thicker kind of smoke. That's entirely up to you. And lighting is a key thing to keep in mind as well. So that's worked out really well for the shading. I'm really happy with the end result. And I'll let this render. So the two of these together will work out quite well because you can layer them on top of each other. And again, I intend to make this much darker in the comp, but that's good. And the reason why I've made this emit from a pivot, okay, is because now what I can do, I'll get my birth and I'll get my position. I'll move them up here. I'll delete the wire, relink this, and then click on send out, and then link that in here. And now I get the exact same result as I did a second ago. The difference is that if I wanted, I could have another system. I could hold down shift and choose copy. And I'll delete the wire. I'll hold down shift, copy this one across, link that in here, and I'll link that one in here. Okay, so just quickly, all I've done is I've duplicated these two PFS smokestacks, and I've duplicated the berth, and I've positioned this here. The reason I duplicated the berth is because maybe this one could start at frame 50, and I could set the rate of this one to be only like 100, which is half. What's now going to happen is I'll have this smokestack, then at frame 50 I have a secondary smokestack emitting. And these are all replicatable, and they all filter into the same event. So they use the same smokestack node, the same speed, so I can change the divergence to affect both. I can do anything I want, and that will all be updatable. So in other words, I can now distribute these wherever I want in my shot. What I'll do is I'll go to display, hide, camera, and lights, just so I can look at this now. And we have these smokestacks, and I could reposition these wherever I feel in my shot, and it will update. Okay, so that's really good for me because it means that I can get exactly what I'm after. Um, and we can distribute like heaps of these wherever we feel like having them. I could even do this if I wanted to. So there we have like a bunch being emitted. Let's get rid of these. Alright, so that's really good. It means that these are really easy to plug in. And if we look at our end result as well, we have our box representing the dimensions. This matches pretty much well as after. And now we have a blowing, which is all controlled by the wind. So that's it. We've created our smokestack. I'll do a final render at a proper resolution. And we've also set it up in an intuitive enough way that we can do a lot with it in terms of shifting it around, retiming it, whatever else we feel like doing. The final thing, if you wanted, you could go down to phase and set an end time and have that shift the phase over time. That way what will happen is the shape will kind of change over time as well. So that might be something to play with. You can also reduce the amount of particles that you're rendering, just in case this was too many. Let's go back in here, like actually in Afterburn. I'll go to here. We could just do the same thing with, first of all, the phase. I could set this to be 10. Keep in mind it's over a long time. And now the phase will change shape. Usually if I'm doing this though, what I'll do is I'll have this happen very quickly at the beginning and then slow down over time, just because the initial energy is making it churn, and then after a little bit it's more just kind of dispersing based on the wind. And regularity, if we wanted, we can enable this and set this to really low. Regularity essentially will blend between being spherical or a noise shape, so we could have this kind of break apart more. And you can animate the high and low, like bias and gain, all that kind of stuff. Colors, you name it. And yeah, so what I was going to say is we could make this render every 10th or 5th particle, so that way it's not dealing with as many particles if we wanted. But we risk it kind of looking a bit too cotton ball-y if we do that. So naturally it's rendering much quicker. So there are a few of the options to play with, and again, you can do a lot with this. So yeah, I hope you guys found this really informative. This is kind of a technique I've been using for a lot of game cinematics, a lot of movies as well, like a lot of CG feature films and a lot of visual effects for like train smokestacks or buildings on fire, stuff like that. You can do very similar in fume effects, but I figured this would be something to point out that, like, again, afterburn is something that you should still be using. Fume effects is great, but use it in the right situations. Obviously here setting the nth to 5 is a little bit too much, but you know, just kind of find the particle count to deal with. But you know, afterburn you can use for a lot of stuff still to get some very specific stuff, some good results and everything. So go ahead and experiment, and good luck.